Welcome everyone to episode 157 of the Send Nutrition Podcast with your host Bryan Peter today. And today's title of our podcast is, Does carbohydrate loading work on performance horses? How are you, Peter?
Bryan, I'm very well, very well. Sounds a little bit scary, Bryan, for the punters out there listening.
Well, we all know we like our Italian at Sen, and there's a lot of carbs there. And what we're trying to get through in this podcast is the way we feed our horses is not necessarily the way we feed ourselves. Like, you may hear of these carb loadings for a performance runner or a marathon runner the night before to get their glycogen up or their carbs up. But what we've found in the performance industry is some horse owners adapt this to their horses. And we're on here today to try and get through what is fact and what is fiction about this.
Yeah, that's well said. And look, I think because the human side has obviously, with the carb loading, has been around for a very long time, and it does work obviously on humans. But as we said previously, horses are fiber fermenters. They're really vegetarians, so they do produce obviously energy in the small intestine as well as the hindgut. So it's more about getting that balance right with the energy production. Obviously, having the carbohydrates there for that anaerobic work, the short, sharp stuff, but then having the foundation there in the hindgut where you get the fiber fermentation, volatile fatty acids to produce energy. So it's all about balance pretty much.
Yeah, and the aim is to try and equip our knowledge or our anatomy of the horse in a more simple way to help the horse's energy in their performance be less explosive and more controlled and focused. And our Send Feed program really focuses around this, and we're going to give you the reasons behind the scenes of why we set it up this way. Because firstly, when you hear the term carbohydrates are actually, there's two different types. You've got structural carbohydrates, which are good for the horse. That's actually fiber. So not to confuse you, but fiber is a carbohydrate, but it is structural in the foundation. And this is really good for the horse's hindgut. The good bacteria ferment this, as Peter said, and it produces fuel for your horse that is steady, and it's the number one energy system for your horse. But the other type of carbohydrate, which is what we're talking about today, is the non-structural carbohydrates, which is the fast energy, which in your diet is the sugar and starch that can come from grains or a sweet feed or pellets that are grain-based. Now, they are the fast energy, and this is what we're talking about today, to not overload because of the horse's anatomy and the way they're designed to digest it.
Is that similar, Bryan, to comparing like a mid-strength beer and a tequila shot?
Same pathway, you go through the liver.
But one's going to get me drunk quicker than the other.
Well, yeah, you can say that. But if we look at our horse's digestive system, and we can bring it right back to, in simple terms, and comparing it to a human is what we try and do to make it more relatable. At the end of the day, we're both mammals, so we've both got a stomach, but then the differences are in our small intestine and our large intestine, or the horse's hindgut. So in the small intestine of a horse, they can't handle large amounts of sugar and starch because they've only got so much enzyme to cut this up and then use for energy. So think about starch as a line of beads, and they're all together in your horse's small intestine, and the enzymes are like scissors that is cutting it up. If you overload it with too many beads of starch, those undigested beads go into the hindgut of the horse, and this is where they wreak havoc and promote bad bacteria or sugar-loving bacteria, and they don't promote fiber fermentation, and they produce acid, which is detrimental to the hindgut health of your horse.
So what Bryan's explaining there is pretty much a bout of hindgut acidosis. So the horse can only cop about 1 kilogram of grain in any one sitting. So what happens is older horses are more prone to hindgut acidosis because, like Bryan mentioned, those beads don't get cut up by the scissors quick enough, and then the overflow goes into the hindgut where it's not where it's not supposed to be, and that drops the pH of the horse. So you can actually see, well, you can actually test the pH in the manure, and it'll actually give you a number which is obviously acidic, or whether it's neutral, or whether it's a higher pH if you have a horse that's on a higher fiber diet. So the hindgut acidosis is a real problem for all horses, not just performance horses, because what happens is, let's just say you've got 50% of energy getting produced in the small intestine through carbohydrates, and you've got 50% of energy getting produced in the hindgut through fiber fermentation, volatile fatty acids. If you get carbohydrates in the hindgut, well, now that stops that energy production in the hindgut. No one really knows by how much it reduces the energy production. It may be by 10%, it might be by 15, 20%. Probably depends on how severe the hindgut acidosis is. So now you don't have a horse firing on 2 batteries. You've got a horse firing on probably a battery and a half, and that's going to limit performance.
Yeah, that's well said, Peter. When you don't have efficient fiber fermentation in the hindgut because the good bacteria are being destroyed or are not flourishing in a safe pH range, what we've found is that pH range for the good bacteria to flourish has to be above 6.2, below 6.8. Anywhere below that 6.2 mark is too acidic for the good bacteria to really flourish and do their job as the main energy source for your horse in the fiber fermentation. So overwhelming that small intestine with sugar and starch is not only detrimental for the health of your horse, but also the performance efficiency.
Yeah, well summarized. And if you're thinking, geez, you suspect your horse may have signs or showing symptoms of hindgut acidosis, and you can't measure the manure, they're normally going to be looking really skinny or losing weight rapidly. And the instinct is, well, let's give it more carbohydrates, or, let's give it more starch, or let's give it more sugar to try to put the weight on. And if you've got a horse that you're feeding more and it's losing more weight, that's a telltale sign of hindgut acidosis. So you've actually got to cut all the starch out. You've got to cut the carbohydrates out. You've got to start focusing on getting high quality fiber, obviously through roughage, obviously a product like the Grain-Free Ultimate with 35% fiber. So we actually got to reduce the root cause of the problem, which is excess starch going into the hindgut, and stopping that overflow into the hindgut and feeding the hindgut fiber will actually wake up those microbes to start fermenting fiber again. And now you're going to get the balance back in order, and then in time, hopefully that horse will start putting on weight once we stem the flow of carbohydrates into the hindgut.
And as Pete touched on before, we can go into the specifics of the amount of starch per meal. And in a general term or general rule, for a performance horse, the maximum of 1 gram of starch per kg body weight per meal. So roughly 500 kg horse, 500 grams of starch per meal is the absolute ceiling. Ideally, you want to target slightly below, but it does depend on your horse's muscle mass as well. There's a lot of glycogen stores in there, but that's on general terms. And what we see in a lot of performance horse industries, Pete, is 2 to 3 times that. And when you look at the amount of starch in that small intestine that could be undigested, you're not looking after the hindgut health optimally if you are not adhering to that upper limit of 500 grams per meal.
And look, it's not really the trainer's fault or the owners or anything like that. It's just lack of education, and it's a little bit, we've been doing this for 50 years. We've had results with this for 50 years, and it gets passed down to generation. But because Bryan and I, we've got our hands sort of at the wheel, not falling asleep. Any sort of latest research that comes through, we're all over it, and then we're trying to share it. And it's not about, obviously, trying to get just everything done under the one roof. You got to look at your horse as an individual, and you may have a horse that's 400 kilos, you've got one that's 450, you've got one that's possibly 600. We still see this day in, day out. Some people are feeding a 600 kilo horse the same amount of food as a 400 kilo horse, and that's like, I'm lost for words.
We're not adjusting. And Peter and I see this in a lot of performance horses, and all we're doing is working backwards. So if you see these 3 symptoms that we do see, so poor recovery, behavior changes, so hot or inconsistent behavior, or ulcers are getting worse, or I can't get rid of ulcers. If you work back from that step and you look at the amount of starch going into the horse per meal, if it's over that 500 gram mark, then looking at what it's doing to the hindgut health, the pH is dropping, the good bacteria are being disturbed. There's rapid fermentation of that starch, so the lactic acid spikes. So when all this happens, that outcome is what those three symptoms are. And we're simply letting horse owners of performance horses know, if you can get that right amount of sugar and starch into that small intestine and be efficiently digested, you're going to eliminate those three issues straight away and tick that box. Then you can work on your training, consistency, and other stable management for the horse.
On a side note too, with the 500 grams of starch, that's for a 500 kilo horse as well. So if you have got a 400 kilo horse or a 350 kilo horse, that starch is going to be less. So if you're listening to this and going, geez, I'm feeding my 550 kilo horse the same as my 400 kilo horse, that 400 kilo horse is going to be a lot more affected if it's eating the same amount of food. The smart ones will probably start leaving food, and now you're scratching your head and going, like, why is the small horse leaving food? Well, it's probably trying to tell you that it's probably getting too much starch already. It's trying to sort of protect itself. Not always, but 9 times out of 10 that would be the case. So you got to look at your body weight, and you got to feed according to body weight. You can't just say, well, because on the back of the bag it's got 6 kilos or 4 kilos. Well, everyone's going to get painted with the same paintbrush. It can't be like that.
Yeah, exactly, Pete. You have to be a scientist of your own horse. That's why we offer the free diet consults, because you can't just feed what your friend's feeding, because your horse should be treated as an individual. When we go down the path of working out these diets, we can give you another example of how well balanced the Sen Ultimate is as a feed. So we try and eliminate adding extra bits and pieces to a performance diet where required. So we're trying to not add some grain on top, because we know our sugar and starch levels in our feed is around that 12.8% on the back of the bag. If you give 2 kgs of the Sen Ultimate, you're supplying around that 250 grams of starch per meal. You look at how safe that is. That's an even amount of energy going in. That's promoting good hindgut bacteria health, plus even behavior, because there's no rapid insulin spike from that sugar and starch from the Ultimate. And then if the performance horse needs that little bit of more energy, we look at the whole diet. You're looking at your roughage. So you may be on an oat and hay that has sugar and starch as well. You're going to provide some fat as energy in the form of sen oil with the high omega-3. So it all is different components of a diet to get that required output of energy for your chosen discipline for your horse.
Yeah, that's well outlined. When I do the diets with Bryan, we always start with the roughage first. So we've got some guys that are just got grass in the ground, and we try to formulate a diet around grass in the ground. Most people will add some sort of hay as well, just obviously for the dry matter. But a diet that's going to be, say, in Victoria, South Australia, even Tasmania, we get a lot of customers there that have an oat and hay. Okay, so I'll give a brief example. With an oat and hay, it's probably not much point adding oats or adding corn or adding barley, because we're getting the sugar out of the oat and the hay. So the carbohydrates, obviously for the muscle glycogen, we're using the hay to top up the glycogen stores, and then we're plugging in the holes in the oat and hay, which is low protein. So we may add some cracked lupins into that hay to balance up the protein, and then because the hay's deficient in vitamins and minerals, we'll add a product like the grain-free Ultimate to plug in all the holes with all the B vitamins, calcium, magnesium, manganese, high quality protein. The hay's dried, obviously. It's dry matter, doesn't have much fat. So then we add a product like the sen oil. So we build a diet around the actual roughage itself. So as you can see that example, there's no added grain into that particular diet, because we're using the sugar out of the hay. On the flip side, sort of New South Wales, Queensland, Rhodes grass is pretty rampant here, whether it's a teff hay, Rhodes grass. When we use that sort of roughage, well, then we have to add oats, because these grassy hays are very low in sugar, very low in starch. And for performance horses, there's just not enough sugar and starch in that particular grass hay. So, we may add oats, and obviously we've still got to plug the holes in the Rhodes grass with the grain-free Ultimate. It's still lacking fat, so we'll add the sen oil. So I'm giving you an example there of like two diets that are similar but yet they're different. The mistake a lot of trainers make, not having this information, is they'll just feed a lucerne hay, and then they'll be adding lupins into it, and then they may another protein source, and now you've got a way oversupply of protein. which is detrimental to a performance horse as well. So sometimes, when we do sort of, speak to potential customers, we ask a lot of questions, try to get down to the bottom, whether they're overdoing something, underdoing something, and then try to balance it out.
Yeah, that's well explained, Pete. We really have to adapt to the current conditions in Australia, especially down south with the hay types that you guys have access to down there, because of course we want that roughage amount for your horse. And if oat and hay is the only one you can get, which is better than barley hay, but then more importantly, it can be adapted to our diet. And as Peter explained, oat and hay can be treated like a grain because of the sugar and starch that is in that hay type. And when you look at the traditional feed bags that are grain-based, so you're feeding grain in that, you're adding more grain out of oats, barley or corn, then you're feeding oat and hay. This is not helping the horse's digestive system really digest nutrients to help the output of energy, because really you're only servicing the small intestine and not that hindgut, which, as we said before, can be up to 80% of the energy output for a performance horse.
And then on the back of that, going back to our podcast topic, carbohydrate loading. Imagine what you just said on top of the sugar starchy hay. You've got the grain-based, feed. You may be adding corn into that, and now the night before the actual performance, you're going to be carbohydrate loading that particular horse. That's 100% certainty that horse is going to get starch overflow into the hindgut, and it actually limits performance. You may not limit performance the first night you do it or the night before, but the longer you do it, the more that you're going into these performances, you're getting more and more starch overflowing into the hindgut, and then it affects the horse's performance in time.
Yeah, it really highlights the benefits of going a grain-free feed bag and then adapting the grain around it and controlling that amount of sugar and starch going in for the energy output that you want. And also, why pay extra for a grain-based feed with vitamin minerals when you can get that straight grain like oats that is cheap per bag without other bits and pieces and fillers through it? But actually that brings up another topic, and it is which grains are safe for a horse to digest raw and which ones need to be heat treated. And this has been a big topic in the recent years in terms of oats for a horse raw are the safest grain because the enzymes in the small intestine of the horse can cut up that starch nicely. It's not so simple in corn and barley. They need to be heat treated. If you have a trainer that's feeding raw corn, they're actually adding to the acidosis to the hindgut because it's been proven that the enzymes in the horse cannot cut up the starch in corn. And if you are feeding barley and corn, it needs to be micronized or heat treated to be safely cut up by the horse. So it actually should be outlawed that you feed a horse raw corn because you're actually poisoning them.
Yeah, Brian, it's very scary for obviously performance trainers, even owners, and this is why we sort of jump on his podcast just to sort of spread the message, let them know. It is very daunting as well because you've got your friends telling you one thing, you've got your maybe your mum and dad or your uncle who's trained horses for 30 years saying, well, this is what we've done for 20 years. But what I'm finding it's not never, but there's not many times that they give you a reason why they do what they do. And then if you look at horses, I think we said about 90% of race horses have some sort of ulcers. I'm not saying that the diet that we're proposing is going to be ulcer-free, but with the pH test that we've done with the trainers that are using our program, I think we've got about a 99% strike rate, yeah?
Yeah, it's been fantastic. And it's just about adjusting the amount going into their system. And 9 times out of 10, it's just those smaller fillies or the smaller mares that are around that 400 kg mark that need to be looked at more closely.
And they actually do better on a lower feed portion daily. So let's just say you've got a 400 kilo horse and it's getting 6 kilos. When you bring that total feed down to 4.5 or 5 kilos, the actual horse performs better because the overload of starch is not going into the hindgut. And then obviously it's producing the right amount of energy in a small intestine and obviously the same amount of energy in the hindgut.
Yeah. Sorry to all the corn growers out there.
Brian, you're going to send them bankrupt.
Just We just can't feed them to our horses.
Hey, Brian, you know what the corn's good for?
Popcorn.
No, our tacos.
Yes. Everything in moderation in that as well. But I've been really thinking, this is another side note, that like in the racing industry, there's a lot of old wives' tales, and a few things about they kind of demonize oats. I'm trying to get to the bottom of it because they go, oh, we can't give the oats to the fillies because they tie up. Like this goes around continually, and oats is the safest starch choice or starch source for a racehorse. So if it's being broken down nicely, good energy for the horse, how is it contributing to tying up in these fillies? Is it the high phosphorus and it's not balanced by the calcium? And then is the trainer not feeding enough calcium, and that's used in muscle health? So tying up is a muscle issue. It gets demonized for the wrong thing, and then that's when I see, and it is to this day, there are trainers that get truckloads of corn in, raw corn, and feed it to their horse and then have to patch up issues that are going on. It just blows my mind that there should probably be a gold standard in feeding performance horses that is brought out by the authorities.
Absolutely. The customers or potential customers, the farm visits that we've had, or even the stables for that matter, I've asked that question probably a dozen times, and Brian's been with me as well. Whenever we sort of propose oats, it's like, like the guys go blue and they think that like we're trying to poison their horses. And I mean, look, I'm joking, but the oats gets basically knocked on the head like it's I don't know, like it's poison. But what I think is happening is the trainer's not looking at their base feed. So an example may be is they'll have a complete feed that the first ingredient is barley. Okay, and that horse is getting 6 kilograms of that particular feed per day, yet the first ingredient is barley. So being the first ingredient, it's going to be at least 40-50% of the actual product. And then a second ingredient might be mill run, which is 35% starch. And then the third one might be corn, argument's sake. Let's just say that sits at around about 40% sugar and starch. Okay, so that poor horse is getting 6 kilograms of a feed that's roughly 400 grams out of each kilo of sugar and starch. So 6 fours are 24. So that's 2.4 kilos of starch per day. And what happens, and this is just my theory, I haven't proved it yet. What happens is that horse will get, in the evening feed, it'll get half a kilo of oats, which is only going to be 250 grams of starch on top of the 2.4 kilos in the feed. And yet the oats gets to blame. Yeah. But it's the last thing that's added, because obviously it's already getting a heap of starch through the feed. The last thing that's added is oats, and then the horse shows symptoms or signs of tying up, and the blame goes on the 240 grams rather than the 2.4 kilos.
Yeah, exactly right, Pete. And when they feed this way, they have to patch it up. They have to try and get all these buffer supplements to try and help the acid in the hindgut and the omeprazole use all for the ulcers, when they could just simply get a more even sugar and starch profile going into the horse. It's just...
It's frustrating for us as well.
The industry is changing because there is leading trainers that are feeding better with more roughage, a better sugar and starch profile, but it's still out there.
Yeah, and I think that's why we sort of offer the free diet consult. And it's not, it's not a obligation you've got to go with us when you talk to us. We can look at your diet. We can try to see what may be contributing to this poor performance or the drop in condition. It is about balance. It is very hard to get a low sugar, low starch feed into a performance stable, because obviously the lower the sugar, the lower the starch, the lower the energy. So we can't afford to sacrifice the energy. But with the diet that we have, as I mentioned, if you've got a starchy or sugary hay, we've got an option for that. If you've got a grassy hay, we've got an option for that. You may have not much hay, but you've only got a grass diet. And that's good on paper when you look at it. But, grass is about 70% moisture. So if you've got 20% protein in your grass and the horses are not getting any hay, you're really only getting, say if it's 20%, you're only getting 30% of that 20%. Yeah?
Yeah, you're getting six grams of protein per kg that they munch,
which is not enough to build muscle and top line.
No. So they need that substitute of that grassy hay or grassy lucerne to go in. But I think, I think what you've outlined there, Pete, is the way we set up our diets is actually giving the horse more longevity in their performance. We're not here for that quick hit to their mask. We're actually trying to promote less supplements and getting those foundations right first. Then you can work out what your horse really requires and what they lack in their natural ability that you want to give that performance advantage.
I'll leave a few golden nuggets for our listeners, obviously, to look out for if they're getting these sort of signs and symptoms. If they are feeding too much carbohydrates, but they're not knowing that they're feeding too much carbohydrates, and what that looks like is, say, with your performance horse, and it could be any performance horse, is they take long to get fit. Okay, so if you've got a high carbohydrate diet, if you can imagine you're eating Macca's, KFC, you're having a pizza, 3 times a week, you're going to the gym trying to get fit. It's very hard to get fit when you've got so much carbohydrates, the protein's low quality, hard to build muscle, hard to build stamina. So if you've got a horse that struggles to get fit and you've got to just keep working and working and working and it's like blowing and blowing and blowing, that's a big telltale sign that the horse has got too much carbohydrate in its diet. When you're doing your performance event and the horse goes off the feed after the event, it's blowing really bad, or for a long time, like swells up over the rear end. That's another telltale sign of excess carbohydrates. Obviously, the manure, if the poo was really loose or really watery. Obviously, not everyone's got the ability to test the pH, but 9 times out of 10, if you've been with your horse for a long time, when it is really loose, that's another telltale sign. If it smells off,
that real acid smell.
Yeah, the acidic smells are a giveaway as well. So when you do look closely and you look for anything that doesn't look normal, that's pretty much your red flags.
Yeah, and I think one recent diet changeover, and it actually backs up what Peter's saying, and we won't name the industry yet because it's a industry that's traditionally grain over grain over grain. I hope Pete knows what I'm talking about here, but when we interrupted their diet halfway through the grain over grain over grain back to our profile, the horses do go backwards before they go forwards. But what we've noticed is when a new season comes along and you train on a diet that's not overloaded on grain and has more fat, fiber, protein balance, the horses are actually holding their weight better top line, better stamina, because you're building their fitness foundation on better energy systems that is within the horse, not just that one energy system from the small intestine.
I know exactly what you're referring to, Brian.
We won't put the cart before the horse, but that'll be a podcast later in the year.
And I'll give an example. So if you can imagine with this industry, it's a stop-start industry, basically stop, start, go fast, go slow, go fast, go slow. So the initial context is that, geez, we got to give them a lot of energy because they go really fast. The problem is they go really fast, but then they stop. And you got to look at, when you give them so much energy, you're going to give them so much carbohydrates. You got to train them hard. You got to work it off. The issue is it's not like a fuel tank where you're on empty. You're going to pull up at the servo. You're going to start filling the fuel or gases for our American listeners. You're going to fill up the fuel. When you keep filling and filling and filling, we get the click when it stops. But if you keep pressing it down, it overflows. So that's what's happening to your horse. When you keep filling it with fuel, you're filling it with grain. And if you're not going to stop either feeding that fuel or filling that car, or you're not going to stop feeding the carbohydrates into your horse, it's going to overflow into the hindgut. And then you're going to get, we get the smelly hand of the petrol, but then your horse is going to get that starch going into the hindgut where the pH drop, and that causes pain, affects performance. So sorry for my long-winded answer. What I'm trying to say is that you've actually got to base the feeding upon the training that you're doing, not just the event that you're competing in.
Yeah, and if you follow that as well, if it's all balanced, you've got a better behaved, more focused horse. Will give evidence of that fitness foundation as they come off. But another layer to this is this industry has to actually perform on consecutive days, because then that leads us to our next topic, which is glycogen replenishment in a performance horse. So what we think about glycogen in a horse, glycogen is the stored glucose in the muscles of your horse. This is what is accessed after they've burnt their fiber, their fat, and this is what's accessed and actually shows up in the amount of stamina a horse has and prevents fatigue at the end of a performance. So if they can access these glycogen stores when they need that short, sharp burst during a performance, this is what we're trying to preserve with feeding a more balanced approach. Because if you only feed glucose or starch and less fiber and fat, they actually have to access this glycogen earlier, and that means they fatigue earlier because they'll deplete their stores.
I just thought of a really good example, Brian,
Good.
and I'm going to share it with our listeners. So, as Brian said, it's the sugar in the muscle, it's the explosive work, but it's only really short. And those glycogen, obviously, they don't last forever. They can empty pretty quickly. And what came into my mind was if you're driving your car, and you put your foot down and you're driving, but yet you've got a turbo. So when you get to a particular RPM, the turbo kicks in and it spills up and it revs really quickly. The problem is you don't want to be redlining that turbo for too long because it's going to break. So how that relates to a horse is that you need to build muscle and top line in the horse. The bigger the muscle, the more glycogen that horse can store. The more glycogen that horse can store, the longer it can go at that sharper intensity, at that sharper speed. Obviously, you got to build aerobic foundation as well with that. But the bigger the muscle, the more glycogen. And we find it that with these bigger horses, the 500 kilo horses, the 600 kilo horses, those performance horses can get away and do get away with a higher starch, high carbohydrate diet, because we've had this conversation with some of the consults as well. I've got my friend that's feeding this much feed and a horse is fine, but I've got my 400 kilo horse and I'm feeding the same amount of feed and my horse is not. So that's how we put two and two together with the research that we've done. Obviously, that bigger horse has got much more muscle mass, keeps a lot more glycogen, where the smaller horse can't do that.
Yeah, and it can be due to genetics as well, with the amount of enzyme they produce in that small intestine. But as Peter said, putting a blanket approach between horses is really detrimental or unfair for that smaller horse. The other part of a nicely balanced diet is that fat adaptation in training. So with the sen oil, and it's what we really promote, the 100 mils, 200 mils, even endurance higher than that, what it does is your horse relies less on the glycogen during the work. It preserves those glycogen stores instead of constantly chasing it to replace the energy. So what we find is the horses on that sen oil being trained in the foundation can really generate better energy and obviously promote longer stamina. But then it's also linked with proper electrolyte, salt, and their water intake, because glycogen storage is linked with water balance. And as we know, dehydration leads to poor recovery and poor muscle contraction. So going back to glycogen replenishment, it's not just that meal after the work or after your training that replenishes. In a horse, full replenishment of glycogen happens over 72 hours, so that 3 days. And what we've run into with a lot of trainers is a short, sharp workout within 24 hours or 48 hours of the big event can actually deplete those glycogen stores to not 100%, down to 50%, which can be detrimental to performance, because you want to go in there with as high amount of glycogen in the muscles as possible.
Yeah, there's a real science to it, and it's all a juggling act, and you don't want to drop one ball, because that ball you drop and then unbalances all the other balls, and that's where we get the high gut acidosis. What I'd like to say is, if you're listening to us and going, geez, I may be feeding too much starch, I may not. I've got this this smaller horse. What we do recommend in some of the diet consults that we do is, if you think that you're feeding just enough grain and the horse cannot or does not need any more and it's lacking energy, that's where you smash that sen oil. Like, as an example, 300 to 350 ml of sen oil is almost the equivalent of a kilo of oats or a kilo of barley or a kilo of corn. So if your horse does lack energy, but you're seeing the symptoms and signs of too much carbohydrates, the symptoms we said with the hindgut acidosis, what you can do is you can remove the carbohydrates down. I'm not saying remove it all. Lower the carbohydrates, say by a kilo, add 300 ml of oil. So you're going to be getting exactly the same energy as what you were getting with your hard feed, without the risk of hindgut acidosis, without that risk of tying up, without the risk of bad behavior. Because with that insulin spike happening every single day, this is why your horse sometimes is a little bit sort of off chops or a little bit mad or spooky. Some horses don't handle those insulin spikes very well. So if you have got one that shies at everything and it's just on the toe all the time, have a look at what you're feeding. And a really good test is, reduce what you're feeding, add the senol. Obviously, you got to build up to 300 ml over 2 weeks. You only go day one at 300 ml. But we find it's not just the omega-3 benefits to coat health, to hoof health, everything else. For performance, which is what this podcast is about, you can easily replace up to 1 kilogram of oats or corn, or even the feed that you're feeding, which may be grain-based or have a lot of carbohydrates, and replace it with our sen oil.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Pete. And I think to summarize all this and answer the podcast title question, does carbohydrate loading work in performance horses? The answer is no. As we've just outlined, those carbohydrates we talk about is sugars, starch, and fructans. And to summarize it, a horse isn't designed to handle the huge starch loads. It can't digest the starch. If you push past that limit, it disturbs the hindgut environment, so the good bacteria where a lot of the energy should be coming from for your horse. And that is the nutritional equivalent of fueling a Ferrari through the exhaust pipe.
Oh, I love that, Brian. Hey, if our listeners are not scared and they're already onto their second bottle of the unwatered Chardonnay, we've done our job. We're scaring you.
I think we've used another analogy, putting diesel in a
petrol car tank,
car, or one of those hybrids or something.
Yeah. Look, it is scary. There's a lot of information out that, worst of all, there's more noise out there. Everyone's preaching a different message. So we try to put a bit of clarity, but also base it on science and actual facts. So, don't believe us, but do your own research. But what we can offer you is a free diet consult. So you're either going to get myself or Brian or Angelique. There's no obligation, as I mentioned previously. Sometimes it's good to bounce what you're doing or what you're thinking off someone else, because you do get stuck in that rut and you just keep doing and doing and doing. And if you've got the same problem and it's been the same problem for a while, it's probably good to get a second opinion.
Yeah, that's well said, Pete. We do around 100 diet consults a month in all industries. We've seen it all. Probably over the years, we've helped thousands of horse owners really simplify their diet, make it way more affordable, because there is a lot of waste we see. A lot of horse owners don't have a reason for feeding a particular thing. It's just been passed down, or they have just left it in the diet. So with the price of fuel and everything these days, it's really good to get smart with your horse. At Sen, we have a full solution for this. And as Peter said, the diet booking is quite easy. We have this calendar on our website and you can book a 15-minute consult. There's no time limit, really. We get to the bottom of what is going on and the aims for your horse, and we try and step it through. And we also do a follow-up as well, if required.
I think you touched on a good point with the cost of living obviously going up, with everything going up. Look, 9 times out of 10, we can balance a diet with your existing pasture or with your existing hay, possibly with a grain-free ultimate and a little bit of oil and salt. Depending where you live, that could be as little as $5 or $6 a day. Just no nonsense. Only add what you need. As Brian mentioned, you might have got a sample from someone or some brand and you've kept it in there for 8 years. But then is it actually doing anything, or is it just costing you money? So getting a second opinion, I think, is paramount.
Yeah, 100% agree, Pete. And the other thing that's going up is our Spotify reviews. We're over 152 now. So if you guys have made it through this podcast to this point and you really enjoyed it, please hit that 5-star on Spotify, and also the Apple Podcast app if you're listening on there as well. It really helps us out.
Awesome. I think we've pretty much summarised. We're probably going a bit overtime on this one, and I'm sure the listeners can sort of feel our energy, because it is pretty close to us, getting the right philosophy, but getting the message out there that, grain is not the enemy. but it can be the enemy if it is overdone.
Yeah, 100%. I really echo those thoughts. Sugar and starch is not the enemy. An unbalanced diet is the enemy for a horse.
I think that sums it all up, Bryan. Any final words?
That I think we'll just leave it at that. But yeah, as we said, we got those free diet consults. If you got a quick question, just call our office. We don't have an AI bot that answers it, or we'll palm you off to a call center in Pakistan or somewhere. But yeah, no, we really can't thank you guys enough for all your support. And at the end of the day, we're trying to help as many horse owners understand their diets and the way they're feeding for a reason. So thanks, everyone.